All right, everybody, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome back to the end of the 11th week together. So we are right at that point where we're about to hit the final month of school. So a lot going on, a lot of pressure, a lot of probably assignments and whatnot in your other classes. Definitely the time to be putting everything you have into this process, making sure that every moment is spent wisely. Don't waste any moments. Don't relax. It's not a time to relax, aside from, of course, hopefully some sleep time that you give yourself. But beyond that, like, you should be focusing on everything that you're doing here in school to make sure that you make this all work out for yourself, so that, again, like, you can have a good summer, you can feel good about what you've accomplished here. All the work that you've already put in will not be for nothing. It'll mean something. And that's what all this is about. It's about you creating experiences that mean something, not just like checking things off a list of things you have to do, and then ultimately it meaning nothing because you're actually not learning anything and not growing and etc. as a person. So make sure that you do place a lot of importance in these last few weeks of the semester and make this all work out for yourselves. So we've got another exam coming up on Tuesday, as you all know. It should be very clear to those of you that are plugged into the course what the exam is going to be on. Ideally, you've been keeping up with the material that we've been covering, so it shouldn't be too difficult of a time for you to prepare for the exam. But again, if you're the type that kind of leaves things to the last minute, you've got some extra minutes to be able to study for this exam. You got about 4 days, so do your best. But like I've said before, like, you should be learning the stuff as we move along and just reviewing stuff before an exam versus like you sitting down and trying to learn everything or even parts of things at the end, which is a recipe for disaster because it took me weeks to present this to you. You can't learn it all in a night. You can't learn it all in a couple of nights. But if you dedicate yourself the entire weekend, you might be able to learn it all in the entire weekend. So it's up to you. It's up to you depending on how much you're willing to dedicate. Either way, in the end, it's an important weekend. Make sure you make the most of it. Make sure that on Tuesday, you have a strong showing, that you come away with a good exam grade, and that sets the path for you to have a really strong finish in the class, and you can then use this as a springboard to whatever's next. And for those of you who didn't do too well in the last exam, there's a real big opportunity for you to come back and kind of stabilize and maybe even move up that class social ladder that we have. Because again, we've already curved an exam, so the class will be curved. So yes, the second exam will be curved as well, but ultimately the grades in the class will be curved, and so only so many people will be at the top, and only so many people will be in the middle, and there will be people at the bottom. So people will fail the class, and people will get A's, and some people will get B's, and a lot of people will get C's. But there will be people that will completely lose here, and you will have to retake this course. Some of you are trying to use this course for getting into the business program. The business program doesn't consider any class passed unless you get a C in it. So make sure that you keep that in mind if you're in that bottom area of the hierarchy right now. So really, really important weekend for you, for those of you that did wind up there. But I know a lot of you that I see here on a regular basis are fully dedicated to learning and doing well. And so I'm sure you're not there. And so just maintain what you've done. Just keep excelling at the level you have been, and everything's going to work out for you. And you're going to earn a good grade in the class, and you'll realize that the work that you put in was worth something. It was worth your time and effort. All right, are there any questions you'd like me to address before I move into the last part of Chapter 12, which will close out the second part of the course? Great. So as far as the exam goes, conditions will be exactly the same. I'll just link you to the original email from last time that told you exactly what you need for the exam, but it's the Scantron, it's just a regular old calculator, no graphing calculators, and just use the bathroom before you get here, and that's it. Good question? Correct. It is only going to be based on the last chapters that we cover, which I think are about 4 or 5 chapters. Other questions? All right. So we finally have been able to get to one of the market settings that we're going to be studying in very fine detail to figure out how firms can best maneuver their way through this market setting in order to optimize their value. Firms are valued in markets based on the amount of profits that they're expected to make over a given time horizon. And so that's why in this class and in economics in general, we're always focused on, as far as firms go, like maximizing their profits. Like they're trying to make the most profit possible, because by making the most profit possible, they're creating the most value in their firm, which means that then they are selling their stocks at the highest possible value, and that allows them to then be able to gain access to like financial markets, to borrow more money, to get bigger, to do the things that they want to do to, continue thriving. And so in order to be able to even examine this decision, we had to start last chapter setting up a framework of costs, which is a reflection of a firm's production. So first we had to have a production function introduced as a model of production. General, very very average, very not taking into consideration all complexities of production. Just the most general a production process can go was our production process, and that told us something about the costs, which now can be considered to be able to figure out, how much the firm should be selling in a market, how much profits they'll be able to earn, and how that may change in the short run versus the long run, which we'll talk about. And again, this is one of 4 settings we'll consider. This is the most competitive a market can be. It's our first model of a market. Then we'll consider the least competitive market, a monopoly, once we've passed the exam next week. And then we'll have a couple in-between cases which are a little bit more complicated, but tend to have a little bit more applicability in the common markets that we all tend to be consumers in. Most markets aren't monopolies, and most aren't perfectly competitive markets. So we are going to be building on the information that we're learning here. So, this chapter is, again, telling us how firms can operate in the most competitive setting, and that will always be referenced when we're talking about these other settings, because, you always, anytime you're doing any kind of analysis, it's always good to kind of state how far the situations can go in either direction, so that when you're actually talking about whatever you're talking about, you can compare it to the extremes, and it gives you a little bit more insight into what you're analyzing. So that's part of what this is about, presenting these extreme cases, so that then you can understand, well, given what markets could be, let's look at what they likely are, and then we can sort of think, okay, well, if things change, then it can either go in this direction or that direction, and these chapters give us an idea of what those directions look like. But again, there are markets that are perfectly competitive, and there are markets that are monopolies, so there's relevance there just for that sake. All right, just before I move on, remember this whole section has been about marginal analysis. So we did a Chapter 9, general sort of introduction to what marginal analysis is, and what economic profit is, and what the costs and benefits are that we look at in economics. So make sure you understand all that. Chapter 10, we looked at the consumer side of the market and how consumers make decisions to consume. So that was just one chapter, but we did look at the appendix there as well. And the model is just meant to give us an idea of how we can use marginal analysis to study the way that consumers reach the decision to consume, which then tells us something about the overall demand in a market. But that really stopped there, and then now we're jumping to the other side of the market, and we have a lot more sort of possible scenarios that firms can exist in to make decisions in, which is why we have so many different models to consider that, which is why the last part of the course mainly just kind of takes us through these various ones, and And so there's definitely a lot more connectivity in the ideas on the supply side than on the demand side. On the demand side, it's very specific to like, just again, a person buying everything that they can buy, given that they have a certain amount of income and that they face prices for the things that they want to buy. So just make sure that you got that chapter down, and like if you're going into the business program, like you do understand it as well, because it will always be referenced, those ideas. And as you move forward in the business program, you'll see all of this again at a more sophisticated level. So the more you learn here, the easier it will be for you moving forward. All right, so again, last time we started studying the decision to produce a certain amount, and we looked at the cost and how that affects it, and that got us to an individual supply curve for each firm. So then we'll be able to look at how we can get from that to the overall industry supply curve, which is the supply curve that we've been looking at in our supply and demand model in the first part of the course. So that sort of that'll tie this back to where we started from. And then that'll end the chapter. But let's quickly go over the stuff we covered last time, just as a refresher for you. So again, we're dealing with the most competitive case of a market, and we call it perfect competition. In a perfectly competitive market, everybody's a price taker, both consumers and producers. Nobody can affect the price. So if you're a big buyer, you can't say to sellers, oh, well, I'm a big buyer, you should give me a different price. No, there's enough buyers to go around where you would not have any leverage in a perfectly competitive market, regardless of the volume that you're buying. Same thing goes for sellers. If sellers are really high volume sellers in a perfectly competitive market, they won't be able to set their own prices, have prices different than other people, because everybody is selling the same thing, and there's a lot of folks selling this stuff. So even if you have big producers, most producers, there will be enough other producers where even the large producers will kind of get drowned out by the fact that there's so many others. And so nobody on either side has any ability to set prices. So in a perfectly competitive market, all market participants, both consumers and producers, are price takers, as I mentioned. Two necessary conditions for perfect competition. It must contain many producers, none of whom have a large market share. So nobody can have like a super huge market share in these markets. Again, because there's just so many firms in these markets that again, even if a firm has a large market share, which is their sales as a proportion of all sales in the market, it won't be that big. And then the other necessary condition is that everybody sells the same thing, a standardized product, generally termed a commodity. So they're very general things that nobody can really take and say, this is my special version of this, and I'm going to get to charge a different price because mine's different than yours. No, everybody's is the same. So you think of like raw materials like oil, iron, like lumber, like just very raw materials, generally will be transacted in perfectly competitive markets. Money, if you've taken macroeconomics, like you see that there's a demand and a supply model for money markets. And so you can generally think of money as being like a standardized commodity as well. And a perfectly competitive market would suit, the model of perfect competition would suit that, like money markets as well. So there's a lot of different examples that would fall under the category of this market that we're studying in this chapter. So one really important aspect of these chapters is of these markets is that there's free entry and exit, meaning firms can easily enter and easily exit the market in the long run. In the long run is the time when all inputs are variable, so they can either get the capital they need to be able to enter the market, and really easily. There's no problem with trying to get that stuff in these markets. Whereas in monopoly and the in-between cases, there are what are called barriers to entry, which stop firms from entering markets, either because there are legal barriers, like there are patents, those sorts of things, or maybe firms need to be of a certain size in order to be able to even compete in those industries, and therefore that is a barrier to entry. You can't just be any old person wanting to sell. Like, you need to be able to invest millions of dollars in setting up the factory, buying the equipment, etc., to be able to even just sell. So those are called barriers to entry, and those do not exist in perfectly competitive markets. There's free entry and exit into these markets. Yes. Yeah, so just like agricultural products, like, you just need a little bit of land and you buy some tractors and the seeds and water and you're able to grow, wheat, There's free entry. Anybody can do it. But, would you do it? Well, it depends on whether or not there are profits or not to be made in that industry. But if there are, you would easily be able to get in. Whereas if you wanted to get into, like, let's say, the car market, and you wanted to sell like the same car as, like, a Ford type of car, like like a Ford truck or something, like, you couldn't, because you don't have patents on all the technology that they use to make that exact car, right? So that's a barrier to entry. That means there is no free entry and exit in those type of markets. All right, production and profits. So we looked at how these firms set their profit maximizing quantities, the quantity that's going to make them the most amount of money. The difference between the amount they can earn in the market, their revenue, the price times quantity, minus the cost of selling that amount. So that's their profit. So how they do it is they have to, of course, compare their marginal cost to their marginal benefit, which is going to equal in markets, marginal revenue, the extra revenue they gain from selling additional units, which in a perfectly competitive market is equal to price. So for a perfectly competitive firm to set their profit maximizing quantity, they set marginal cost equal to their price. So here's the overall market in the industry with the demand and the supply curve. Again, this represents all market participants, but in this chapter, we're looking at decision making by individual firms. So we need to look at the perspective of the market by the individual firm. For the perspective of the market of the individual firm is that they are price takers, and therefore their demand is just a flat, horizontal, what we say perfectly elastic demand curve at the price being set in the market, at the equilibrium price being set at the market. This is the individual firm's perspective on that market, and therefore this is the demand that they face. The extra revenue they gain by selling additional units, Gesundheit, is just the price. And so that is their marginal revenue, the additional revenue generated by selling one more unit of output. And they want to operate at the point where the marginal revenue is either greater than or equal to the marginal cost. So we saw that this firm will supply 50 trees, because that's the point where, if you're going from 40 to 50, the marginal cost of additional trees is equal to 16. And the marginal revenue is equal to 18, so marginal revenue is above marginal cost. But if they were to go to 60, we see that the marginal cost goes up to 20 because of diminishing returns to labor in the short run. And we see that marginal revenue is constant because, again, price equals marginal revenue for a perfectly competitive firm. And so to go to 60, their marginal cost would exceed their marginal revenue, which wouldn't make sense. So 50 is their profit maximizing quantity given the cost conditions and the revenue that they face. Then we looked at that same result graphically. So here's the marginal revenue curve. Again, it equals, it is the demand curve that the firm faces. Here is their marginal cost curve, swoosh shape, meaning it goes down first and then increases because, again, we assume that there are increasing returns initially due to specialization for the firm, meaning marginal cost is decreasing. And then because of diminishing returns to labor, marginal cost tends to increase. That's why you get that shape. So the optimal quantity for a perfectly competitive firm using the graphical analysis is obviously going to be the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue over the length where marginal cost is increasing. So so if they were to operate anywhere along here, marginal revenue would be above marginal cost, which means that they can earn more revenue than it would cost them to sell And so it makes sense for them to continue making more until they get to the point where those are equal. Beyond that, we see marginal cost exceeds marginal revenue, so it doesn't make sense to go beyond that point. So the optimal point, the profit maximizing quantity, is a point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So once the firm understands how much they should be supplying based on following that rule, marginal cost equals marginal revenue, which equals price. And the reason I emphasize marginal revenue equals price here is because later when we look at the other less competitive markets, marginal revenue will be less than price. We'll talk about why that is later, but that's why it's important to emphasize it here, because again, that's a very specific characteristic to a perfectly competitive market, that price equals marginal revenue. And therefore, the profit maximizing quantity is set at the point where marginal revenue equals, where marginal cost equals price. All right, so profit. So now once they figure out how much they want to sell based on that rule, they then need to figure out, are we profitable or not? And that's where our average total cost curve comes in. So here's our U-shaped average total cost curve. In this particular situation, at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, that's also the point where average total cost is equal to the marginal cost. And so there is no difference here between the average amount it costs them to produce at this level and the average amount that they will earn at this level, which is the marginal revenue. And so, so there's zero economic profit being made in this particular example. But we might have a different situation. So if the average total cost curve is below the price, the marginal revenue curve, so here's the point where they're going to supply, at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue, so they're going to supply 50. At that point, we see the average total cost of producing is less than the price. And so there is profit to be made there. And the profits can be represented by this rectangle, which again represents the fact that at the profit maximizing level of output, you have a price, and then you have an average cost of producing, and then you multiply that by the total amount that are being supplied at that price, which is 50, and that gives you this rectangle, and so that represents the profits for the firm. Of course, they can be in a different situation where the average total cost of producing is actually above the price at the profit maximizing level of output. So again, this firm set their profit maximizing level of output at the point where marginal cost equals price. So they're selling 30. At that level, now they have to figure out, am I making a profit or not? Well, let's look up to the average total cost of producing at that level. It's above what they're earning in the market. So they're losing on each unit that they're selling. The difference between the average cost of producing and what they're collecting, which is the price, times the amount, can be represented as the amount of loss in profits, graphically as this rectangle here. So the minimum of the average total cost curve is known as the break-even price. It's, again, the price where the firm at least breaks even and they make zero economic profit. But if the price falls below the average total cost, the break-even price, then they will make losses. Yes? Yes. The average total cost needs to be below the marginal revenue in order for there to be a profit. And if it is just touching it, we say it's just tangent to it, then there are zero economic profits, as was the case in that first one we looked at there. Yeah.
Point C.
Uh-huh.
Not on this slide, on two slides ahead.
Uh-huh.
Does that mean we're covering our losses at point C? Is that what you just said?
Well, so in order for this firm to operate at point C, something would have to happen in the market, either a shift in the supply or the demand curve that would raise the equilibrium price, and therefore it would raise the marginal revenue curve up till that point. At that point, then at the very least, the firm would be breaking even.
So right now at point C, we're still taking a loss.
Well, we're not at point C. We're over here. This is how much they're producing, and so there is a loss there. This is how much they're charging. This is how much it costs them on average to produce, and so it costs them more on average to produce than what they're earning on average, times the amount they're selling. This is the loss that they're incurring. You see it? All right. So let's once again go through this short-run production decision in general, in fine detail, because I want you to make sure that you understand it. We talked about this last time, where if the average variable cost curve is below the price, then at the very least, the firm, even if they're making losses, they're covering their wages and some of their fixed costs, and so it makes sense for them to continue operating. Whereas if the price is above the average variable cost, is below the average variable cost curve, then at that point, they're not even earning enough revenues to pay for their wages for their workers, so they should shut down. So this is basically examining the decision to supply when the firm is losing money, when they're making losses, when their average total cost of producing is above the price in the profit maximizing level of output. All right, so here's again the standard cost curves. Here's our swoosh-shaped marginal cost curve. There's a U-shaped average total cost curve. The bottom of it occurs where marginal cost crosses it. Here's our U-shaped average variable cost curve. The minimum of that happens where marginal cost crosses it. And we see that the distance between average total cost and average variable cost is shrinking as we move from left to right, and that's because the difference between those is the average fixed cost. And we know that average fixed cost is always going down in the short run because you have a fixed amount of money that was spent on the fixed input being divided by a number that's getting bigger and bigger, the quantity. And so as the firm gets bigger and bigger in what they're willing to supply, then the average fixed cost goes down, which is why we see the distance between these two narrow as we move from left to right. All right, so this is again the minimum of the average variable cost curve. We consider two cases: when the market price is below the minimum of the average variable cost, and when the market price is greater or equal to the minimum of the average variable cost. So here's a situation where, again, the firm is maximizing their profits at the point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. At that point, average total cost is above the price, so they are making losses. But in this case, the average variable cost is below the price. So given that they're making losses, the firm has two options. They can either shut down or not shut down. If they shut down, they will collect no revenue, so they'll sell nothing, so they won't get that price times quantity revenue. But they will still have to pay their fixed costs until they get into the long run, when they can get rid of their capital and get out of the industry. The other option is just to keep producing, collect revenue, sell some goods, earn the price times the quantity sold, that's their revenue, and pay both their fixed and their variable costs. So if they're running their operation, they have to pay for the variable cost, which is their labor, because their people are working for them. So in this case, again, price times quantity, here's the revenue. And we see that the average variable cost is below the price, and so the revenue is covering all of the wages. So here's the profit maximizing quantity. At that quantity, here's the average variable cost, which tells us, on average, how much the cost of producing is attributable to just like the wages they're paying people to produce. So we see that the revenue, which is the green box, is covering that completely. There's some revenue left over. That means that the difference between average total cost and average variable cost is the average fixed cost times the quantity is the total fixed cost. So this box, the difference, again, the green box and the non-colored box are the fixed costs. And we see that some revenues are covering that. So if the firm were to shut down, they'd have to pay this entire amount out of pocket. But if they continue operating, at least some of their revenues are covering that. So even though they're making a loss, it makes sense for them to continue operating. So total revenues pay for part of the fixed costs. And so the economic losses are less than they would be, which would be the sum of the purple and the blue box if they shut down. All right, and then the other scenario is, again, the firm at their profit maximizing level of output, which is set at the point where price equals marginal cost. At that point, average total cost is above the price, so there are economic losses being made. In this scenario, though, average variable cost is also above the price. So here's the revenues. They're not even covering the wages of the employees. Here's the fixed costs. So if the firm shuts down, this is all that they would have to pay for. But if they continue operating, they have to pay for not just the fixed cost, but also some of the variable costs out of pocket. They have to pay for some wages out of pocket because again, they're making losses and the price at the profit maximizing level is below the average variable cost of producing. So the minimum of the average variable cost curve is known as the shutdown price. If the price in the market is set at that price or below, then the firm should shut down. At that point, they are incurring greater losses, meaning they have to pay out more than their fixed costs, and so they should shut down and just pay their fixed costs until they can get out of their contracts, get out of their leases, and get out of the industry. All right, having understood that, we can now establish what the individual firm's supply curve looks like. So the individual firm's supply curve in the short run is going to be their marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost, because the marginal cost curve, again, dictates how much they're going to supply in relation to the price that's being set in the market, right? They set their level of output at the point where the price equals marginal cost. So here we have the price equaling 10 at the shutdown price, at the minimum of the average variable cost. They're not going to supply at that point. They're going to shut down. But let's say, there's a supply and demand over here, and let's say supply increases because wages go down. That lowers the equilibrium price. Obviously, that won't do anything here. But let's say that the demand increases because incomes go up, and that increases the equilibrium price to $12 to $14 to $18. Well, at all of those prices, the firm is going to supply, and how much they'll supply will depend on where that price hits their marginal cost curve. So the marginal cost curve is essentially their supply curve. It's what they establish to be sort of the rule that tells them how much they're going to supply. And we see that the marginal cost, again, is upward sloping like a normal supply curve. So this is the individual curve, the individual firm supply curve in the short run. All right, so the industry supply curve. So now we can get from the short run individual supply curve to the industry supply curve. The industry supply curve is the relation between price and total output of an industry as a whole. It is that supply curve, that upward sloping supply curve that you've come to know very intimately since the beginning of the course. So the industry supply curve must be analyzed in somewhat different ways for the short run and the long run. So the short run industry supply curve. So recall that in the short run, the number of producers in an industry is fixed, meaning that there's no entry and exit. All right. So in the short run, how we get from the individual supply curves to the market supply curve is we do horizontal summation across prices. So here is Mr. Silva's individual supply curve, which is his marginal cost curve above his minimum average variable cost for the coffee market. I know it says cotton, but I have to change that. Anyway, and here's Mr. Liu's supply curve for the same thing. And so again, this represents Mr. Silva's willingness to supply based on his own costs, based on his own production facilities, which are embodied in his production function, which then gets us to his marginal cost. So that's what this is. And Mr. Liu has a completely different factory and a completely different, set of costs that he faces. So his marginal cost is going to be different than Mr. Silva's. But still, it is going to be his marginal cost curve above the minimum of his average variable cost curve. And so to get from these individual suppliers to the market supply curve, we just look at a price, and then we do a horizontal summation across those prices to see how much each individual supplier is willing to supply at those prices. So at $2, Silva is willing to supply 3 pounds of coffee, and Liu is willing to supply 2 pounds of coffee. So at the industry level, to get to the market supply curve at $2, the market will supply 5 pounds of coffee. Same thing at $1. At $1, Silva is willing to supply 2, Liu is willing to supply 1. So at $1 in the market supply will be 3 units, 1 plus 2. But again, this is the short run industry supply curve. So the result is the short run industry supply curve shown as S here. The long run will look different because in the long run, firms may enter or exit the industry. So let's think about the things that might happen throughout the course of the short run to a firm. So here is the market and here's the individual firm. Here's the demand curve, here's the supply curve, there's the equilibrium price, $18. Here's the individual firm, here is their market, here's their marginal cost curve, and here's their average total cost curve. So at $18, they set their profit maximizing level at the point where, again, price equals marginal cost, so they're going to supply 50 units. And then we see that average total cost is below the price, so they're going to be profitable. So here the difference between the price they're charging and their average total cost will be their profit. And if you multiply that by the quantity, then you'll get the total profit. So this rectangle here represents the total profits for this firm at a price of 18 bucks. So profits are being made in the industry, a lot obviously, and therefore that's going to attract other people, other firms to come into the industry. So as we start moving to the long run and firms start to enter the industry, that's going to shift the supply curve to the right. At any given price, more firms are going to want to supply. So that shifts the supply curve to the right, that lowers the equilibrium price, and now this firm has to react to that new price and set their new profit maximizing level at the point where $16, the price, equals their marginal cost. So they are going to supply, in this case, 45 units. At that new price, they are, again, making profit. It's a little bit less. It's going to be the box made up of these like striped lines. So again, it's the difference between the price they're charging, 16, the average total cost of producing, times the quantity. So this box represents now their profit. So we see that profits have lured in more firms, which have eroded profits because price has decreased. Eventually, there will be enough firms that will enter the market being lured in by the fact that there are profits that the supply curve will shift to the point where price is going to be exactly equal to the shutdown price, the break-even price, the minimum of the average total cost curve. So here supply shifted to the right, more firms enter the market, the price is now $14. The firm decides, I'm going to supply at the point where $14 equals my marginal cost, which is 40 units in this case. And that also happens to be the point where price equals the minimum of the average total cost. And therefore, there are zero economic profits for this firm to make in the long run. In the long run, economic profits will draw in other firms because there is free entry and exit into these markets. Nothing stopping other firms from entering. So they will enter until all profits are eroded. And in the long run, there will be zero economic profits made for perfectly competitive firms. Yeah.
Profit is
so you figure out where the firm is going to produce, which is the point where price equals marginal cost. And then once you have that quantity, then you figure out what is the average cost of producing at that level. And then you subtract the average cost from the price to get you the profit on the 1 unit, multiply it by the entire amount that's being sold, and yeah, you get the overall profits. So that's what those rectangles represent there. Alrighty. So yeah, in the long run, the price will equal the break-even price. So here's a firm in the short run making economic losses because the average total cost is above and the average variable cost is below the price. So again, it sets its profit maximizing output at the point where price equals marginal cost. And then we see that average total cost is above the price, so there's economic losses. But average variable cost is below that, so the firm continued operating in the short run. In the long run, though, this is not going to be the only firm making losses like this. If there's firms making losses, there's more than one firm making losses. In the long run, they will exit the market. When they exit the market, the supply curve is going to shift to the left. So the supply curve shifts to the left, and it's going to raise the equilibrium price in this case, right? It goes from there to there. Enough firms will exit the market to the point where the remaining firms will, again, be operating at the point where their price is equal to the minimum of the average total cost. So once again, price will equal the break-even price in the long run for firms, even in an industry where there are losses to be made. So if If there are, in the short run, economic profits, firms will enter, that will erode profits. If there are economic losses being made, firms will exit, and that will bring up the price to the point where the existing firms that remain are making zero economic profits as well. So regardless of what the situation is, in the long run, where these markets are always heading, like it's always heading towards the long run, all firms in the perfectly competitive markets earn zero economic profits. But remember, we're talking about zero economic profits, as I reminded you last time, we're talking about positive accounting profits, right? We're talking about revenues minus both implicit and explicit costs. The explicit costs are the costs we talked about here, but the implicit costs are like what's the next best option that they could be engaging in if they weren't investing all their capital into producing and maybe just like, you know, buying a bunch of stocks and bonds or whatever and getting like a minimum return in markets. So at the very least, they are earning their implicit costs when we say that they're making zero economic profit. So to explore further the significance of the difference between short-run and long-run equilibrium, consider the effect of an increase in demand on an industry with free entry that is initially in long-run equilibrium. So this industry is initially in long-run equilibrium. This graph over here represents just an existing firm, their response to an increase in demand. And over here, it represents the same firm, but their response to an increase in new entrants, new firms that have entered the market to compete against them. Right now, we assume that the market is in the long run, and so the price is equal to the minimum of the average total cost. So the market is in the long run. This is the overall market in the middle. The overall supply and overall demand in the market representing the supply of all the firms. This is just a representative firm. All right, so everything's fine. It's in the long run. Zero economic profit is being made. All of a sudden, let's say incomes have gone up. And so at any given price, people are willing to buy more of everything. Demand shifts to the right. That increases the price above the minimum of the average total cost curve. So now the firm will be making economic profits. They will set their profit maximizing level of output at the point where price equals marginal cost. That's going to be above average total cost. Economic profits are being made. So this firm will increase their output. But of course, economic profits will mean that firms are going to get lured into the industry now. There's money to be made. More folks are going to want to make some of that money. So firms will enter the market. Supply will shift to the right, and eventually it will shift to the right to the point where now price will once again be equal to the minimum of the average total cost curve. So when the firms enter the market, that will drive the price down. And so the existing firms will lower their output again to the point where price equals marginal cost, which has been driven down by the entrance of new participants, driving our price back down to the minimum of the average total cost. So in the long run, the supply curve for the industry is just going to be a flat horizontal line at the price that corresponds to the minimum of the average total cost to produce in the industry. So in the long run, you're going to get just like a flat supply curve that doesn't respond to changes in price. It's always moving to that price. In this case, it's $14, which corresponds to the minimum of the average total cost. But the thing you have to understand about the long run is that we're never actually in the long run, but the industries are always trying to get to the long run. Like it's always kind of moving in that direction. But the world is more complicated than a simple model where we hold a lot of things constant to be able to identify, you know, how things work and be able to explain things. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts in the world. So we're never actually here, but here is the point that we're always getting to in these industries. And so it's good to understand that. It's good to know that regardless of what's happening, this is what's eventually going to happen or is trying to happen if, you know, a certain set of, if everything else was sort of controlled for and the world operated the way our simple model does. But it doesn't. But understanding this tendency gives you an understanding of how these industries ultimately are behaving and maybe have to respond, because they know that in the long run that their profits will be eroded. So if there are profits that are being made and the firm knows that they are in a perfectly competitive market, then they know that eventually they won't be able to make those profits. So perfectly elastic long-run supply is actually a good assumption for many industries. So many industries do exhibit this long-run, perfectly elastic supply curve. All right, let's do a couple of practice short answer questions and then call it a day. Perfectly competitive firm in the short run. Draw a graph showing a perfectly competitive firm in the short run, choosing the option to shut down. Make sure you show the price and the average total cost as well as the average variable cost. All right, so they're going to make the decision to shut down in the short run, right? So what does that mean about the average cost of producing relative to the price that's being charged? It's going to be higher, right? There's losses being made. What does that mean about the average variable cost relative to the price? It's not going to be lower. It's going to be above the price, right? The average variable cost will also be above the price because that means that revenues aren't even covering wages. All right, so just really quick, let's once again go through perfectly competitive firm and what the short run means and shut down. Perfectly competitive firm, again, a market in which perfectly competitive market, a market in which all participants are price takers. Price taker, a producer whose actions have no effect on the market price of the good or service it sells. Again, here's a perfectly competitive market. All firms are price takers, so the perspective on the market, demand is a flat horizontal demand curve. So that's the first thing you would draw is, of course, your marginal revenue curve at the price. Optimal output would then need to be established by setting price equal to marginal cost. So you would need to then draw in your marginal cost curves, swoosh-shaped, Gesundheit. And then you would need to identify your optimal quantity of supply. So that's the first step. Like, how much is the firm going to supply? And then, like, it's about, okay, well, are there profits being made? Should the firm shut down? But before you even do that, you need to know how much is being supplied. And we figure that out through marginal analysis. Marginal revenue equals price equals marginal cost. So the point where marginal cost equals price. All right. Let me see. What's next? Short run and then shut down. Okay, so a firm's decision of whether or not to stay in a given business depends on its economic profit, the measure of profit based on the opportunity cost of resources used in the business. Again, that is revenues minus both explicit and implicit costs. We talked about the implicit costs of, like, let's say if a person is using their resources to produce and they're not investing that money and getting a return, so they're giving that up. So that's an implicit cost. For you guys here, you're going to school, so you're now working. So while you're here, your implicit cost is the wages you're not earning. Your explicit costs are the costs you pay out, though. For a firm, it's the cost they pay to wages, the cost they pay for the factory, for the machines, etc., for the raw materials, the wages that they pay employees. Those are all the explicit costs. Accounting profit, again, is calculated by just subtracting explicit costs from the revenues. So a firm's decision to stay in business or to close down permanently should be based on economic profit, not accounting profit. And profit is equal to total revenue minus total cost, which is also equal to the average revenue minus the average cost times the quantity. So profit equals, again, the difference between price and average total cost times the quantity. All right, so here's the average total cost. In this case, the firm is making losses or profits? Profits, right? Price is above average total cost at the optimal quantity of supplying. So there's the economic profits that can easily be identified. Again, the difference between the price and the marginal cost times the amount being sold. All right, but again, we're being told that the firm is making the losses, right? And so therefore, the average total cost is going to be above the price. And another thing to make sure you clearly establish is that the average total cost The minimum happens at the point where marginal cost crosses it. We talked about why that is and in the production chapter. But again, it has to do with the fact that you're looking at an average, and this is telling us the cost of producing additional units. So if the cost of producing additional units is below an average, it's going to bring the average down, and then once the cost goes above it, then it'll start to bring the average up, right? So that's why the minimum of the average total cost happens when marginal cost crosses it. In this case, at the profit maximizing level, there's our average total cost. So that's definitely something you would need to be able to identify. The average total cost of producing at the profit maximizing level. You would need to be able to identify losses, right? So it's going to be this rectangle here. All right. So again, the firm is deciding to shut down, right? So as we said, the average variable cost is going to be above the price. So we're in the short run. That means that there's free entry and exit, as I already mentioned earlier. All right. So they're making losses. If they were going to continue operating, obviously it would be a situation like this where the average variable cost would be below the price. So just, I mean, obviously I'm not telling you exactly what's going to be on the exam, but there's going to be something like this in the exam. So you should be able to figure out all different scenarios. That's why I'm going through this several times so that hopefully it's enough so that you're just reviewing this weekend and not trying to get it all down, because again, it can be a mess if you're trying to hurry and learn all this stuff. All right, so here average variable cost is below the price. That means at least the wages are being covered, and so therefore total revenue pays for some of the variable costs. So the firm would continue operating in this case. So that's not a shutdown condition. So therefore, we need to have our average variable cost above the price. But remember, the average variable cost minimum happens again at the point where the marginal cost crosses it. So if you're asked to draw it, you should be able to put it in the right place. And the minimum happens to the left of the minimum of the average total cost. Make sure you are clear on that as well. Make sure you understand the minimum of the average total cost is called what? Say that again. Average total cost? What's the minimum of the average total cost called? Remember, that would be the point where price would equal average total cost, so there would be zero economic profit, so it's called the break-even price, right? What is the shutdown price? What is the shutdown price? In general, it's the minimum of average variable cost curve. Very good. Very good. All right, so we see prices above the shutdown. I mean, it's below the shutdown price, so the firm should shut down. So basically, if you're asked to represent a situation where the firm is deciding to shut down, then you would draw the average variable cost curve above the price. Because here we see the revenues again. There's our total fixed cost. That's what they would have to pay for if they shut down, which would be less than what they have to pay for if they continue operating, because they would have to pay for some of the wages of the employees. All right, so that's basically it. So this is basically the situation that you would have to represent given the prompt of this type of question. All right, let's look at another one. Consider a general case where the cost curves have standard shapes. So if you're told that they have standard shapes, it's these shapes. These are our standard shapes. Suppose a perfectly competitive firm is incurring economic losses in the short run. Show this situation in a graph. So here we're going to be asked to indicate how much economic losses are in the graph. Should the firm shut down? So here you're not being told whether or not it should shut down. You are deciding where to put your average variable cost curve. So you can demonstrate either scenario in this case. And then you're being asked to identify what is the firm's short run individual supply curve. Can somebody describe to me what that is? In words, what is it? As far as the graphs go and everything we've been talking about. The individual firm supply curve is what? Where do we get that? It's a segment of one of our curves above a certain price. Above, so think about it. They're willing to supply until they shut down, right? So it would be above the shutdown price, which is what? This is the minimum of our average variable cost curve, right? So that's the individual firm's supply curve. It's the marginal cost curve above the minimum of the average variable cost curve. Learning this stuff is about repetition. Like you have to go over it a lot to really get it down. And once you do, it all makes sense. And then you've got it in your pocket, and then you can always reference it. It's really useful. It's really useful stuff. All right. Anyway, so here we've demonstrated a firm making economic losses because again, here's the marginal revenue equals price curve, the perfectly elastic demand curve, set equal the marginal cost, establishing our profit maximizing level of output. At that level, to make economic losses, the average total cost would need to be above the price, which it is. So the firm is making economic losses, which we can identify again by the difference between the price and the average cost of producing times the quantity. Should the firm shut down in your graph? Why or why not? Well, we can't figure that out unless we see the average variable cost curve. So here's the average variable cost curve. Should this firm shut down? No, right? Because average variable cost is less than the price. So the price is above the shutdown price. And of course, this one should shut down. So this is a shutdown situation. So it's just the same thing over and over again, ideally enough so that you got it. And you won't need to do that much work this weekend, at least on this stuff, but definitely there's a lot to cover. Anyway, so the short run supply curve, again, happens above the average variable cost curve, and it's, again, the marginal cost curve. So it would be, again, that segment there. So you would need to be able to identify that. Marginal cost curve above the shutdown price, which is the minimum of the average variable cost curve, which is the point at which marginal cost crosses it. It crosses it at its minimum. Are there any questions about this? All right. Indicating a separate set of graphs how the industry will adjust via entry or exit to establish long-run equilibrium. So in the long run, is the firm in your graph still making economic losses? So in the long run, is the firm still making economic losses? Is it in the long run? No, right? In the long run, firms can get out of the market. So in the long run, no firms will be making losses nor profits. They'll be operating at what price? At the break-even price, the minimum of the average total cost. Very good. So we're going to show the long-run equilibrium for your firm in the graph, also show the adjustment in the market. So there's the market there. It sets a price, which is a marginal revenue curve. In this case, the firm is making losses, but is still continuing to operate because average variable cost is below the price. But in the long run, the firms will exit the market, supply will shift to the left, equilibrium will be increased, and that will get our price to the minimum of the average total cost curve, where there is zero economic profit being made. The break-even price. All right, it's just some stuff for you guys to stare at for hours this weekend. Make sure you do. And beyond that, we are done. We're done with the second part of the course. So the ball's in your court now, folks. Put in a lot of work, put in a lot of effort. I want to see some strong performances, at least from you familiar faces. I want to see from you because I know how dedicated you are. And you deserve to get something positive out of this class. So make sure you do. All right? Have a good weekend regardless. I'll see you on Tuesday.